Hey, this is Dr. Ben Weitz, host of the Rational Wellness Podcast. I talk to the leading health and nutrition experts and researchers in the field to bring you the latest in cutting-edge health information. Subscribe to the Rational Wellness Podcast for weekly updates. And to learn more, check out my website, drweitz.com. Thanks for joining me, and let's jump into the podcast. Hello, Rational Wellness Podcasters. Thank you so much for joining me again. For those of you who would like to see a video version of this podcast, please go to my YouTube page. If you go to my website, drweitz.com, you can see detailed show notes and a complete transcript. And for those of you who enjoy listening to the Rational Wellness Podcast, I would certainly appreciate it if you could go to Apple Podcasts and give us a ratings and review. Today, our topic is endometriosis. And this is when endometrial tissue, the tissue that lines the uterus, grows outside of the uterus, most commonly on the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, or the intestines, though it could occur anywhere in the body. It affects 1 in 10 women in the United States. The most common symptom is pain, especially in the pelvis or the lower back region. Endometriosis can also be associated with bladder problems, gut problems like diarrhea, constipation, and bloating. Sounds very much like IBS or SIBO. Headaches, menstrual irregularities, and infertility. There can also be pain during sex or during urination. The conventional medical treatment typically consists of contraceptive pills, surgery to remove the endometrial tissue, and pain medications. Dr. Lara Briden is a naturopathic doctor with more than 20 years of experience. She's a period revolutionary, leading the change to better periods. In fact, the best periods ever. In fact, Lara will be having a huge rally in Oklahoma just so she can make women great again. Just kidding. Lara is a passionate communicator about women's health and alternatives to hormonal birth control. And her book, Period Repair Manual, is really a manifesto of natural treatments for improving hormones and periods and providing many natural solutions, including the use of diet, supplements, and natural hormones. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Briden.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So when we think about endometriosis, it's hard to understand how endometrial tissue ends up in another part of the body other than the uterus, until I read that retrograde menstruation occurs in up to 90% of women. Perhaps you can explain how that occurs.
Well, the menstrual fluid flows backwards out the fallopian tubes into the pelvic cavity. And as you say, that's a pretty standard, common thing to happen.
You know, if that's really the case, how come a lot more women don't have endometriosis?
Well, and that's probably the fatal flaw of the retrograde menstruation theory of endometriosis, which a lot of experts now do not endorse. So that was the theory that it's about almost 100 years old now, that the surgeons who first described endometriosis decided that's how the disease came about, that it just happened to flow back out into the pelvis, and that was the origin of the disease. Of course, as we'll talk about today, there's a lot more to the story. In terms of how the lesions actually get there with endometriosis sufferers, the consensus seems to be it's probably a combination of reasons. I think you think some of them, maybe it was from retrograde menstruation. There's some evidence that it can be laid down before birth, that that type of tissue occurs, is laid down as a fetus, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to turn into endometriosis. And one of the bits of evidence of that, endometriosis lesions have been observed in fetuses, and actually men can have endometriosis as well. It's very rare, but there's been a few cases in the literature about men having active endometriosis lesions.
Oh, interesting.
Which, of course, they have no retrograde
fallopian tubes.
No. So there's a lot more to the disease than the standard model. I think it's fair to say that this disease is undergoing bit of, well, not a bit, but a paradigm shift. You can't have a bit of a paradigm shift, can you? Like it's an all or nothing thing. A paradigm shift is coming for this disease. I think we're just on the tipping point of that, actually. And that will be looking beyond just the presence of the lesions and really thinking more broadly about what's going on that could allow such a terrible disease process to begin to, because it can be terrible. I mean, terrible is not a hyperbole for this disease. It can be mild for some women, but for some women, it can be life-destroying, as in, just pain, debilitating pain that prevents them from working or having a normal life. And it's very sad when that's the case. Yeah.
So what role do hormones, particularly estrogen and progesterone, play in endometriosis?
Well, this is part of the paradigm shift. So the lesions are definitely sensitive to hormones because they're hormone-sensitive tissue. So by definition, they're affected by hormones, of course. But in the position I take, my reading of the literature, is that the disease and the lesions are not caused by hormone imbalance. So they're affected by hormones. Once the lesions are there and it's active disease, it's affected by hormones, particularly by estrogen, which is kind of like petrol or gasoline on the fire, right? So once there's a fire, you put estrogen on that situation and that can make it a lot worse. So that's why the conventional treatment, in addition to surgeries, to remove the lesions, the conventional treatment has been, and still is, to suppress estrogen. And the problem with that approach, as you can imagine, is that women actually need their estrogen. So estrogen, it's not great for anyone to just shut that all down, whether that's with Lupron, like the metotropin suppressing drugs, or even just hormonal contraception. Shutting down estrogen has costs. And I would argue it's actually not really the right tool for the job for this disease. Anyway, my approach is to, as we'll get to, to try to dial down the inflammation and the immune dysfunction that's driving the disease. And so therefore a woman can enjoy the benefits of her own cycling hormones. I think one thing it's fair to say is in the literature and what I've seen with my patients, most women with endometriosis their hormones are okay, as in their hormone balance can be pretty normal. Like they can be having pretty regular cycles, going through the normal estrogen and then progesterone. It's just that they're being affected by those hormones.
What about the estrogen metabolism, their ability to excrete estrogen, and what pathway is that play a role?
I think it could play a small role, yes. I think definitely with an estrogen-sensitive disease, you want to optimize how well your body clears estrogen and not have any as few as possible inflammatory estrogen metabolites around. I think that can be part of the treatment strategy, but it's not the only one. And it's really not even the most targeted part of treatment. But I think there's a role, certainly a place for trying to promote healthy estrogen metabolism. The other thing, just to say on hormone balance, is there's pretty strong evidence now that endometrial lesions, endometriosis, has something called progesterone resistance. So normally the hormone progesterone should have a down-regulating effect on endometrial tissue. That's the normal response. But endometriosis lesions don't experience that as well as they should. So the situation could be a woman who's making progesterone, the beneficial hormone progesterone, but the progesterone is not managing to suppress the lesions. And then, of course, there's a whole strategy of coming in on board with treatment with either a progestin drug, which is actually quite different than progesterone, or even using real progesterone as part of a whole treatment strategy to try to suppress the lesions. And there's a place for that as well. I'm sure you get the feeling. People say it's a complex disease. Right. It is. Yeah.
And what about the role of so-called environmental estrogens or endocrine disrupting substances like BPA and pesticides and, non-stick cookware chemicals and fire retardants and all those lovely chemicals?
It's definitely a role. Like, you know what, Ben? I think some of the role of those environmental toxins, particularly dioxins, that's where a lot of the research has been around endometriosis, are epigenetic. So what that means is some research, I would call it kind of troubling research, but I mean, troubling in the sense that it just is sad to think it's happened a couple generations ago. But there's some evidence that dioxin exposure creates epigenetic change. You know, do your listeners know what I mean by epigenetic?
Yeah. It's the sets of triggers and switches that determines whether your genes get expressed or not, right? Whether they get turned on or turned off.
Yeah, turning on or off genes that is inheritable, right? Heritable. So you can.
The genes are inheritable. Yeah.
Well, and the epigenetic changes are as well.
Right.
This is the radical thing about epigenetics. So we used to think, with every new generation, every baby, they're just kind of a clean slate. These genes are just waiting to be turned on or off. But now we know from studies of epigenetics, which is really less than 20 years old, that not just exposure to environmental toxins, but any kind of environmental influence to one generation can kind of switch on and off genes, alter gene expression that they can then pass on to subsequent generations for generations. So potentially what some of the research, these are animal studies, but what some of the research is showing for some models of endometriosis is, for example, dioxin exposure to a woman, especially maybe with the daughter in utero, alters some epigenetic expression of genes both in the immune system and probably in hormonal receptors as well, particularly the progesterone receptor, that is then passed on to the next generation and then passed on to the next generation. So potentially you have a situation of where one of the reasons that we're starting to see quite a sharp uptick in cases of endometriosis and severity of endometriosis, it wouldn't surprise me at all through my lens or just looking at the literature that some of this is a lag time delayed effect from, say, toxin exposure 2 generations ago in the 1950s or something, right? Like, does that make so? This is what this means for women who suffer the disease. Is I think it's important to say it also means it's not a lifestyle disease, right? It's not something they brought on themselves by eating wrongly or having poor estrogen clearance or anything like that. Like there was something in the blueprint, both genetically, potentially epigenetically, that set them up for this disease. And I think that's important. It feels like you can feel like it's not your fault. It's definitely not your fault.
Even though some of these epigenetic changes are passed on, still there is an opportunity for us to modify our epigenetics by our diet and lifestyle.
There's still the opportunity to modify genetic expression through diet and lifestyle and some other strategies as well. So yes, on the one hand, you can say this is something that happened maybe out of your control, 2 generations ago. Plus, but at the same time, that doesn't mean there's nothing you can do about it. Like you can still, especially because we're mainly going to be talking about the immune system and immune dysfunction with endometriosis, then there are ways we can access that. In fact, in many ways, natural medicine is better set up we're better positioned to influence or modulate immune function, arguably, than, some parts of medicine right now, because they don't, but we just have some tools in our tool belt that are quite useful, particularly for this.
Right.
Disease. Yeah.
Right. Certainly, we have the capability of being able to modulate immune dysfunction as opposed to just turning it off or turning it on the way some of the heavy-hitting pharmaceuticals do.
Yeah. I might just describe, because I've used the word paradigm shift, so I might just describe for your listeners kind of what I mean by that, like in a nutshell. So the old paradigm is that the problem is all about the lesions themselves. It's probably, presumably from retrograde menstruation. You get these bits of endometrial tissue that land in the pelvis, and then there's kind of a to be expected sort of inflammatory response. And everyone knows it's an inflammatory disease. But in the old paradigm, the problem is these lesions shouldn't be there. Therefore, this inflammation ramps up. And therefore, the treatment is to remove the lesion or to suppress the estrogen that causes the lesion to grow. So that's the old paradigm. I think I'd say the new paradigm is best described as the problem is the immune environment that would permit these lesions, and not even permit, but promote the growth of these lesions that probably got there by a variety of mechanisms, maybe by retrograde menstruation. But the interesting thing about endometriosis lesions compared to normal endometrial uterine lining tissue is they're not the same. They're similar, but they're not the same. For example, endometriosis lesions have a nerve supply, which the endometrial tissue does not. So, there's some things going on, and there's an active, with endometriosis lesions, there's an active what's called angiogenesis, like this invasive characteristic to them, which is actually quite similar to a lot of autoimmune diseases, which is why there's been a controversial part of this conversation is, to discuss endometriosis as an autoimmune disease. 8 years ago, I got in a lot of trouble for saying that, quoting the literature that was saying that. Back at that time, that was a lot more controversial. A few years on, I think it's still controversial to say it's autoimmune. At the end of the day, we don't necessarily need to designate it as autoimmune to state quite clearly that it has many aspects of immune dysfunction and looks very similar to other autoimmune diseases, particularly inflammatory bowel disease and celiac and rheumatoid arthritis. And in fact, the celiac genotype, as you know, the HLA-Q, genotype, immune system genotype, like basically, if you have the genes that encode for that kind of immune system, that puts you at risk of celiac disease, but also at risk of endometriosis. There's a lot of overlap. In fact, there was a reproductive immunologist, Jeffrey Braverman, he never published his research, which is a real shame. Like, he only published it kind of casually, but he tested the haplotype, HLA haplotype of all his endometriosis and subclinical endometriosis patients, and found that something like 95% of them had the celiac genotype. So you start to get a picture emerging of what kind of immune system you need to develop this disease.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's kind of been a big trend especially in medicine the last 20 years, is so many diseases now have an autoimmune origin. We just had a discussion with Dr. Mark Pimentel, and there's this autoimmune story about the origin of IBS, which is the most common GI condition. And we always distinguish between the autoimmune conditions like IBD and IBS, which wasn't. Now that has an autoimmune origin, and a lot of heart disease now seems to have autoimmune origin. So that seems to be a increasing story about health and disease.
Yeah.
So if endometriosis is related to immune dysfunction, how do we analyze this? What kinds of things are affecting the immune system?
In terms of treatment, or in terms, I think,
like in terms of diagnosis, and essentially we want to look for like the underlying triggers, right?
Sure.
And causes. Sure. So we have, for example, food sensitivities, right?
Sure. Let's talk it through. So in terms of diagnosis, I'll just touch on that first, because this is, we're 2020, but the diagnosis of endometriosis is trapped back in the Middle Ages somewhere. The diagnosis is by surgery currently, which is
right.
Bizarre. Like, kind of
these lesions, let's cut them out. They shouldn't be there.
Well, and also the only way to definitively diagnose a lot of the time is with surgery, which is really, anyway, that is changing a little bit. There was some new research about using a really specific type of ultrasound, all technicians have to be very trained to be able to try to see, and even then you can't see all endometriosis, but to be able to try to see something on ultrasound. Just for your listeners, having had a normal ultrasound finding, like just your run-of-the-mill ultrasound, pelvic ultrasound, cannot rule out endometriosis, right? Like, you could still totally have the disease and quite.
Is there any other imaging technique that can look at it? MRI?
No, well, laparoscopy. So, surgery. But there's been because of the nature of the disease, that it is arguably a disease of immune dysfunction, there should be a biomarker. So there's been a lot of research, well, not a lot, but there's been some research the last few years trying to find either a blood test or a test of menstrual fluid or something, a marker that you could start to measure the presence of this disease. It would be really helpful for young women who don't want to have to go on the operating table just to try to. So there's that in terms of diagnosis. Now, in terms of treatment, I guess, and what sets up for the disease.
Sure.
I want to talk about kind of a cascade of things that need to be in
let's
place
do that.
to develop the disease. So, because back to, we talk about the role of estrogen. Tons of women have high estrogen and poor estrogen clearance and would never get endometriosis, right? Like you could have extremely high estrogen and endometriosis is just never going to happen for you because you don't have that immune system. So we've got, top of the cascade, if you will, like is having the genotype, probably the celiac genotype, that puts you at risk. Compound that with probably some epigenetic changes that happened either to your ancestors or recent ancestors or to yourself. That creates an immune environment that is already kind of primed for this to happen, but still may not happen. Then you have the presence of the lesions, had to get there somehow, whether laid down before birth or retrograde menstruation, somehow the lesions get there. But then that's not even enough. So then there has to be some estrogen present, which is why children don't typically have endometriosis, but it can kick in as soon as puberty hits. So then estrogen has to come on the scene to start not just inflaming the lesions, but pushing immune function into more of the potentially autoimmune state. But there's a final fifth ingredient that I think is pretty important and is something we can access and treat, which is the presence of gram-negative bacteria in the pelvic microbiome. So as you know, E. coli gram-negative bacteria are present in the gut, and they produce something called LPS, lipopolysaccharide toxin, which is highly so it's a part of their cell wall. It's a bacterial bit of a bacteria, which the immune system can go a bit crazy when it sees that. Like it really doesn't like to see bits of gram-negative bacteria out floating in the body somewhere in the bloodstream, or in this case, in the pelvic area. And so there's some pretty fascinating research called the bacterial contamination theory, where a few things they've done. They've measured that women with endometriosis it's not small, it's like 6 times higher level of LPS in the pelvic cavity and in the menstrual fluid compared to women who don't have endometriosis. And then there's evidence that certain types of antibiotics can reduce the size of endometriosis lesions, though that was an animal study. And the mechanism is proposed to be translocation from the gut to the pelvis. So in other words, intestinal permeability, but not to the bloodstream, or not just to the bloodstream, but actually into the pelvis. And then you get this combination of, in fact, there was an animal study that I've quoted a few times where they had animals with epigenetic changes, progesterone resistance, and from dioxin, combined with estrogen, combined with LPS toxin, and the lesion just went crazy, basically. That is the perfect storm for how to create an active inflammatory disease in the pelvis. And if you understand that and kind of think about it through that lens, then, the first step would be, the first 2 steps, I'll just say off the top, are
fix the gut.
Strictly eliminate gluten, particularly if you have the gluten genotype, and dial down those gram-negative bacteria. Either kill them off. Like I use antimicrobial herbs. I mean, not permanently, but knock them back.
Right.
And yes, work on repairing gut integrity. This link with gut is why we see so much extreme overlap between irritable bowel and inflammatory bowel disease and endometriosis. It's like 95% overlap or something like that. And in terms of endometriosis sufferers, 90 to 95% of them have pretty serious hardcore gut issues going on. And it used to be thought, the endometriosis affects the gut, which is true, but I think a lot of it is the gut is driving endo.
From a functional medicine perspective, how many conditions are not related to the gut? It's amazing.
It's true. So it should be no surprise. And also it's all right there in the same area. I mean, I think there's something to be said for anatomical proximity. I mean, the gut is right there, and can become quite an inflammatory environment.
Right. Yeah. So what are some of the other things that trigger that inflammation?
Well, nutrient deficiency, because the immune system is very nutrient hungry, right? Like it has some requirements for particularly, I would argue zinc and vitamin A. These are simple nutrients, but are pretty darn important. And I mentioned zinc and preformed vitamin A for any of your vegan listeners. I don't know how many you have, but I would say, please, like if you're, exclusively plant-based, you need to think about some zinc and vitamin A, because you can't get it from a plant-based diet, and your immune system requires that. Your gut integrity requires that. And
people don't often mention that for vegetarians. They usually talk about the need for omega-3s and B12 and iron, but
I would also say iodine and choline and selenium. I mean, on one of my blogs, I have a list of about 20 nutrients that I think. Anyway, but staying on the topic of...
No, that's good. Why don't you mention those real quick? Yeah. So besides B12 and iron and omega-3s, you just mentioned zinc. And they need preformed vitamin A, which is only found in animal foods, right?
Correct.
Can they get a vegetarian form of vitamin A?
That's a really good question. I believe so. I mean, most vitamin A supplements are derived from fish oil, so you would have to, or fish liver, so you'd have to kind of source that. I'm not 100% sure.
Right.
And then other nutrients that would be missing on a vegan diet, arguably. Hopefully we're not making too many people angry right now, but, choline, iodine, activated B6, vitamin B2 to some extent, taurine, which is, this we're a little bit off topic of endometriosis right now, but taurine is actually considered a non-essential amino acid, but it's actually really essential for women's health. And estrogen increases our requirement for taurine. It's a neurotransmitter. I feel like it's a calming neurotransmitter for the brain. So again, I would argue if you don't eat meat or don't eat animal products, maybe to take taurine, although unfortunately taurine, I think, is often derived from animal products. So you kind of get into confusing territory around that, but yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So we got these nutrient deficiencies.
Yeah.
So,
and also I guess carrying on with, in terms of endometriosis and other things. Yes, you mentioned food sensitivities in general. So that's going to be some individual, I'd say gluten is across the board almost, and it has to be strictly. There's no such thing as being partially gluten-free for an autoimmune disease, right? Like it's,
right.
Unfortunately, you can't just mostly do it, because unfortunately my experience is you might not get any benefit at all, which is really frustrating. In terms of other food sensitivities, the big ones I see for endo would be cow's dairy, particularly A1 casein, normal cow's dairy. Pretty similar to gluten, as you probably know. They both create this opiate type molecule that can be very upsetting to the immune system. Sometimes eggs, not always, but eggs can be a immune disruptor in some people. And sometimes soy. And then, of course, there's going to be sometimes, there's going to be people who have another food sensitivity. But again, if you have a really long list of food sensitivities, then you just can't accept that that's going to be your life forever. I think a lot of that then goes back to fixing the gut, repairing gut integrity, so that you can then tolerate some of the other foods. On the topic of foods, I guess the other thing to mention is the role of histamine and mast cell activation.
Okay. In
a lot of conditions, in a lot of women's health conditions, but
maybe you could briefly explain mast cell activation.
Yeah, so mast cells are, fair enough, part of our immune system. They're the primitive part of our immune system. Their strategy, they're not making antibodies and targeting things, although that kind of immune problem happens with endometriosis as well. But the mast cells they get upset about something and they just send inflammatory cytokines everywhere, including histamine and heparin. So that kind of histamine response is quite inflammatory. And there are ways to try to stabilize that, including, I would argue, avoiding casein, back to dairy. A1 casein can be quite a strong mast cell activator in some people, not everyone. And also for some women with endometriosis, avoiding foods that are really high in amines or histamine can help to reduce the pain. And so those foods like that would be fermented foods, smoked fish. Some of your listeners might be familiar with kind of histamine intolerance or high histamine foods.
Right.
Part of this, but you don't have to eliminate those completely because you can't, for one thing.
Right.
And they're not like a different category than gluten, say.
Do you recommend a low histamine diet, or do you?
It depends. That would depend on the patient. So I would
Right.
look for signs of histamine intolerance or mast cell activation, particularly hives, urticaria or hives, headaches, congestion, nasal congestion, swelling. And especially if there's a cyclic pattern to that, because histamine will usually track up with estrogen. So if you get those kind of allergic symptoms during your high estrogen phases of your menstrual cycle, then that can be a clue, for
Right.
example. Then I think that can be part of the strategy. Even then, with improving the gut, even the histamine mast cell side of things should improve over time. So you won't necessarily always need to avoid, avocado and high amine foods. It's yeah.
Are there certain natural substances you can take to manage or downregulate histamine and mast cells?
Yeah, well, yes. And I'm sure you may have had, I don't know if you've had mast cell experts on your podcast before. I mean, I'm not fully situated as a total expert in that whole field, but I'm happy to answer, a little bit. But I can say, for example, the enzyme DAO enzyme that helps to clear histamine through the gut is dependent on vitamin B6. So B6 can be quite helpful for that. Having a healthy gut can be, in general, be quite helpful for clearing histamine, reducing mast cell activation. Progesterone itself, the hormone progesterone, generally has an antihistamine effect. So it's another argument potentially for bringing some progesterone on board.
So will you maybe use progesterone even if a woman, say, seems to have somewhat normal progesterone levels?
Yes. So in chapter 9 of my book, Peer-to-Peer Manual, I always refer to this. There's patient stories throughout my book. So chapter 9, patient stories, Hannah, and she ended up with pretty severe endometriosis. And she did gluten-free and some of the things we've already spoken about. She'd been on a progestin brand name called Vizan, which to have sort of a down-regulating effect on the lesion. So she switched to oral micronized progesterone or natural progesterone capsules as that component of her treatment, and did quite well. And so the advantage of progesterone, real progesterone over versus a progestin drug, is usually progesterone is a lot more friendly to the mood and sleep and hair and all sorts. It's a nicer thing to take than a progestin.
And do you prefer oral progesterone over topical?
Yeah, generally, yes. Mainly for a few reasons, but mainly because it actually, the first liver bypass can be good because it generates a lot of something called allopregnolone, which can be quite good for mood. But just staying on the topic of histamine activation, mast cell activation, progesterone, for many women, not all women, should have a stabilizing effect on mast cell and histamine. So that can sometimes relieve those migraines, like hives, kind of premenstrual histamine symptoms. And at the same time, help to manage or control endometriosis. The goal for endometriosis is not cure, right? Because most people agree that there is no cure for the disease, but the term I use is remission. I think a lot of patients can reach a point of, if not no pain would be great, but if not no pain, then close to no pain, at least very much reduced pain. And that would be arguably a state of remission where the disease is not active. The disease is not invading. It's not, progressing. It's not causing pain.
And I saw you write about certain heavy metals like nickel in particular. I saw that relating nickel. So that's kind of interesting.
It is fascinating. So the nickel...
Now, is this somebody who is like high in nickel, like you're running a heavy metal panel and they're high in nickel?
No.
Okay.
It's not heavy metal toxicity, which heavy metal toxicity could be another, sure. I mean, that could affect the immune system. So that's a separate issue. But this didn't make it into my book because I only learned about it. Like there's a study that came out maybe 6 months ago. What they found is pretty mind-blowing. So some people have a nickel sensitivity immune system that reacts badly to nickel. And you know that the test for that is jewelry allergy. So if you try to wear earrings that aren't pure gold, you know, if there's any nickel basically in your jewelry and you get a rash from that, you have nickel allergy. And the problem is that a lot of foods have nickel. So some foods contain it naturally, particularly high cocoa chocolate, which is one of the ones that, you know, made me a bit sad. I don't have a nickel allergy, but still I was like feeling for my patients. It's like, oh, that's sad. But also any canned foods are going to be higher, particularly canned tomatoes, because they pick up a lot of the nickel.
Is there a way to test for this? I've never seen nickel on a food sensitivity test.
Well, the test is the jewelry sensitivity. I mean, I think there's some other skin tests they can do, like where they actually just rub some nickel and see if you get a rash. But I think the jewelry sensitivity is most women know. So when I posted that on my Instagram, so I'll finish explaining what the situation is. So they've known for a while that nickel can play a role in IBS. And so nickel foods can contribute to the inflammation, the dysfunction of the gut. And then for some women, and thereby, you know, removing nickel, or you can't remove them entirely, but dialing them down, reducing nickel intake can relieve IBS symptoms. And then there was a research paper about 6 months ago that found that endometriosis is the same. But like, you know, some women put it, how did they get the details of the study? But basically it was that for people who have a nickel allergy, you know, that allergy itself and the presence of nickel can worsen endometriosis, not cause it. Because as we said, the cause is multifactorial, but can aggravate it. And so when I shared that on my Instagram, I got just like maybe a couple hundred women with endometriosis saying, I have a nickel allergy. Oh, wow, that makes sense. I have a nickel allergy. I'm sure probably there are some endometriosis sufferers who don't have a nickel allergy, but I haven't encountered them yet. So it does seem to be, I think the underlying thing is still the immune dysfunction, right? Like it's not normal for the immune system to get upset about nickel. Like,
so is nickel, it's in the soil and it gets it, is that how it gets some of the foods?
Yes. So it's in the cans. So it's in the soil. So it's just present in some foods that concentrate.
Oh, okay. So foods that you buy in cans.
Yeah. So canned food is a big part of it. And the confusing thing about it is there's actually a bit of overlap with other things like FODMAPs and gluten. So there's quite high nickel in wheat. So then the question is, okay, well, with using wheat as the example. So wheat, you know, seems to be quite a problem for endometriosis for a lot of people. Is it the nickel? Is it FODMAPs because it's aggravating SIBO or IBS? Is it gluten? I suspect it can be all three sometimes. I'd argue probably it's gluten, truly gluten a lot of the times. But as you know, not everyone who reacts badly to wheat has a gluten sensitivity. It can be those other things. It can be FODMAPs. It can be.
Right. And I think Alessio Fasano has taught us that virtually everybody is going to get some gut irritation or tendency towards loosening of the, mucosal membranes, leaky gut from eating gluten. So we're probably best avoiding it.
Yeah. All that said, though, my 2 cents would be, I mean, I guess I'm very familiar with his observation that gluten does create some level of intestinal permeability for everyone. But I'd say for the majority, because for example, I'm not gluten-free. So, I mean, I don't think every single person needs to be gluten-free. That's why I think it's quite important to demarcate those people who do. And particularly if you have an active inflammatory disease, and particularly if you have that haplotype, the HLA celiac haplotype, then I think even if you're not a confirmed celiac, I think the writing's on the wall that gluten is highly problematic or can be.
Right.
Yeah.
What about other metals? Is nickel the only one?
Well, that in terms of this allergy type reaction, I believe so. But in terms of other metals, that's going to be a more insidious, as you know, mercury is an immune toxin. It's a nerve toxin as well, but I'd say immune toxin maybe is one of its more stronger aspects. So we don't want a lot of mercury. As to how big a player that is for some women, I don't know. I mean, it remains to be elucidated, discovered. Yeah.
Do you find have you found use of detox protocols have some benefit for patients with endometriosis with active symptoms?
I don't call it detox. I just don't use that word. I don't know why. I start with the gut. And like I said, I usually start with an antimicrobial, which is often kind of part one, phase one of detox things. I address SIBO if it's there, give the nutrients that are required for repairing intestinal permeability. A lot of that has a natural detox effect, right? Like, so for example, zinc helps with just getting your zinc back online helps protect your body from heavy metals and promote the active excretion of heavy metals. So anything you do to help the immune system also helps the detoxification system. If you know this, but they're quite closely related, actually, the detox and immune function. There's some upstream signaling molecules like NRF2. I don't know if listeners are familiar with that, but it switches on and off genes, both involved with both immune function and detox. So as soon as you start supporting that system, you're going to be getting detox. You're going to be getting, because we're supposed to be detoxing every day. We're supposed to be like eliminating pesticides and heavy metals. And at the same time, yes, it always, in any scenario, makes sense to try to minimize your exposure to any of those things.
Yeah, I guess when I think of detox, I'm thinking about particular nutrients that support the liver pathways that facilitate detoxification.
Here's an example. One of the best studied nutrients, a couple of the phytonutrients that are, one is a phytonutrient, one is just an accessory nutrient that are studied for endometriosis. One is N-Acetyl cysteine,
right,
which has a reputation as being a detox nutrient. It's also an immune modulator.
That's an all-star nutrient for so many purposes.
Yeah. So there was one pretty famous clinical trial using NAC or N-Acetyl cysteine for endometriosis. It was years ago now. It was like in 2014 or something. And and of course they were recommending that this be followed up. There'd be more trials. I'm not aware that there have been many more trials, which is kind of sad, probably just because NAC is, who cares, right? Like, there's no one going to make money on NAC. But in that trial, it was this Italian study, and it was about 100 women or something like that. And their results were astounding. Like, not to hyperbole, not to overstate it, but there were women who had surgery, women who became pregnant, women who had surgeries planned to remove endometriomas, which are quite a large mass of endometriosis, whose endometriomas shrunk to some degree, who canceled their surgeries. Is like just from that one intervention.
And what was the dosage of NAC?
It's a really good question. I tend to give 1,000 milligrams twice a day. In the study, off the top of my head, I don't know what they used. Isn't that range? Okay. Yeah. So that's one. Another one that is probably borderline, superstar for endometriosis is curcumin or turmeric, which you can imagine that, that works by modulating so many aspects of immune function.
You have your favorite form of curcumin?
I don't. I'm always asking my supplement reps, okay, what's I know there's all different forms. It is true that some are better than others. The question is how much.
Companies are always coming up with a new greatest form of curcumin.
The interesting thing about it, so some of the question has been, well, how you need to be able to absorb it, which is probably true. But also we know now that curcumin exerts a lot of its actions in the gut itself, healing, probably having it affecting the microbiome, healing the intestinal permeability. So even if you're not absorbing it, I think it's exerting benefits.
Right.
Curcumin's also a natural aromatase inhibitor, so it can help to dial down estrogen a bit more. So those are a couple of the big ones. Arguably, lots of different modalities or nutrients could be brought on board to try to heal endometriosis. The other one I'll just mention is selenium, just because it's such an important immune modulator for people who live in a selenium deficient region. And this is interesting because I don't know, I think it depends where you are in the States. It depends where your food supply is coming from, but down here, Australia, New Zealand, the food supply is very low in selenium. So I feel very confident that everyone needs it for eating food grown down here. But I think it's going to vary a little bit depending where you are.
Our commercial farming techniques in the United States and the overuse of commercial, nitrogen-based fertilizers, and the overuse of pesticides and glyphosate, and the way our food is so processed, our foods here are pretty much deficient in many things.
Arguably, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Some of those same nutrients that could be potentially beneficial in this arena could also be part of your anti-COVID program to support immune function. Like you mentioned, NAC, that's a all-star for COVID, and zinc, and vitamin D, vitamin A, selenium, curcumin. Those will all be great in that arena too.
Probably true. I won't wade into that conversation, but yes, probably.
Well, not a problem for you.
No, New
Zealanders.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So thank you for this discussion.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts you have for our listeners, viewers, and tell us about how they can get a hold of you and get your book? And
for sure. Well, I guess my final thought on endometriosis is just to take heart. There's a lot more. There are more options than you might realize. There's this stuff out there you can do. And I've seen, in patients and colleagues, lives just be transformed. You can, even if you think all hope is lost and you're different and your situation is way worse, you could always be better than you are. So I would look at it. Like I said, I have a couple blog posts about endometriosis. One's called Treat the Immune System, something like that. Immune treatment for endometriosis. I have Chapter 9 in my book, Period Repair Manual, is about that. So my blog is larabriden.com. All my social media is at Lara Briden. I'm the easiest person in the world to find. And my book is Period Repair Manual. And I have a second book coming out next year about menopause.
Wow.
So menopause and menopause. So it's a slightly different topic, but we could.
Oh, that's great. Good. And that'll be out when?
Not till early next year.
Right.
So it's just being edited right now, fact checked and all that.
Yeah. There you go. Awesome. Yeah. So you're keeping yourself busy. Thank you, Lara.
Yes. Thanks for having me.